Lori, President Trump struck a bipartisan tone through some of his speech, attempting to reach across the aisle on issues like health care and transportation infrastructure. But a lot of people tonight were paying attention to how he would address the shutdown and border security, and the president stayed close to his message.
In the past, most of the people in this room voted for a wall, but the proper wall never got built. I will get it built.
Washington's congressional delegation was captured by cameras multiple times tonight. 3 of the elected leaders from Western Washington told us what they thought of tonight's speech, as did Washington GOP Chair Caleb Heimlich.
The president talked about having a unified message, and I still think his message was divisive. There's some issues that I think are important priorities, like infrastructure, that he has said that he would support. We need real action, not just talk, and so I think his action has to follow up on this.
And a lot of falsehoods, particularly around immigration, but also when he talked about gridlock, I found he had a lot of chutzpah to come in and talk about gridlock and compromise when he just shut down the federal government.
There are several issues that we can come together on and work together on. I'm so relieved that our president talked about health care, because that is one of the issues that so many of us care deeply about. I'm a pediatrician, the only woman doctor in Congress, and the fact that he is talking about the cost of prescription drugs and taking care of people with pre-existing conditions matters a ton to me.
President Trump is seeking to make a deal, and that's what I saw in that speech. He's laying out an agenda saying we want to keep the American people safe, and he wants to work with Democrats to accomplish that. And I think that's something that everybody wants to see.
The president appeared to stay mostly on script during this speech. There were other issues like a call for legislation to ban late-term abortions and funding to help defeat HIV and AIDS. He also made an announcement that he will again be meeting with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un later this month for the second time. But no doubt, at least for the next 10 days, the discussion will center around whether another federal shutdown can be avoided and whether any sort of immigration compromise can be reached. I'm Chris Daniels reporting live in the King 5 newsroom.